She shared her husband with her granddaughter, producing the most inbred children the county ever saw. And now Marcus Williams stared at medical files, documenting impossible genetic damage spreading through Holloway Hollow like poison through generations. 3 generations of deliberate breeding had created something folklore couldn't explain, and the mountain community's silence suggested they knew exactly who orchestrated this biological nightmare, while federal investigators circled closer to the truth. Would Marcus expose the matriarch's twisted control before she silenced him permanently? The Tennessee mountains held their secrets close in 1947, wrapped in morning mist that clung to hollows like protective shrouds. Holloway Hollow sat deeper than most, accessible only by a single dirt road that wound through pine forests and rocky outcroppings, until civilization felt like a distant memory. 200 souls called this valley home, most bearing variations of the same handful of surnames that had echoed through these hills for generations. Marcus Williams shifted his government sedan into low gear as the road pitched downward into the hollow. His briefcase sat beside him, thick with federal health department documents that painted a troubling picture of infant mortality rates 3 times the national average. The war had ended 2 years ago, bringing new federal initiatives to forgotten corners of America, and Holloway Hollow had finally appeared on someone's radar in Washington. The first house he encountered squatted against the hillside like a weathered mushroom, its tin roof patched with mismatched metal scraps. Children peered at him from behind curtained windows, their faces pale and eerily similar despite what appeared to be significant age differences. Marcus parked beside a wooden schoolhouse where a young woman swept the front steps with mechanical precision. Sarah Mitchell looked up as his car door slammed shut, her brown eyes cautious but not unfriendly. She had arrived in Holloway Hollow 3 years earlier, fresh from Teachers College in Nashville, armed with progressive ideas about rural education that the Hollow's isolation had slowly worn down into pragmatic acceptance. Marcus introduced himself, producing his credentials with practiced efficiency. Sarah's grip on the broom handle tightened as she read the federal seal, but she nodded toward the schoolhouse door. Inside, 23 children ranging from 5 to 16 sat at desks carved with decades of initials. What struck Marcus immediately was how many shared identical features. Blue eyes so pale they seemed translucent, prominent foreheads, and a particular way of holding their mouths slightly open. Several showed signs of developmental delays that seemed far too common for such a small population. Sarah dismissed the children for an early recess, waiting until their voices faded before speaking in measured tones about learning difficulties that affected nearly half her students. She mentioned families where children seemed to share characteristics across supposed bloodlines, creating confusion about actual parentage that the community appeared reluctant to clarify. The local physician lived in the Hollow's largest house, a 2-story structure with fresh white paint that stood out against the weathered cabins surrounding it. Dr. Edmund Holloway answered the door himself, a tall man in his 60s whose medical degree from Vanderbilt hung prominently in his front hall. His handshake was firm, his manner professional, but something flickered in his eyes when Marcus explained his mission. Dr. Holloway's medical records painted an impossible picture. Genetic disorders that typically occurred in 1 in 10,000 births appeared in Holloway Hollow at rates that defied statistical probability. Cleft palates, heart defects, severe intellectual disabilities, and physical deformities clustered in family trees that seemed to loop back on themselves in ways that made Marcus's head spin. The doctor explained these anomalies as products of poverty, isolation, and limited access to proper prenatal care. His explanations sounded reasonable until Marcus began comparing birth certificates with medical records, finding discrepancies that suggested deliberate obscuring of parentage information. Rebecca Holloway appeared in the doctor's kitchen doorway as they spoke, a young woman whose haunted expression made her appear older than her 22 years. She carried a baby whose facial features bore an unsettling resemblance to both her own and the doctor's, though she addressed him only as grandfather. When Marcus asked about the child's father, both Rebecca and Dr. Holloway fell silent, the weight of unspoken secrets filling the room like smoke. Walking through the hollow that afternoon, Marcus encountered Thomas Holloway, a man in his 30s whose severe mental disabilities and distinctive physical characteristics painted him as a living testament to genetic catastrophe. Thomas lived with his grandmother, a sharp-eyed woman in her 70s, who watched Marcus from her front porch with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to controlling her environment through sheer force of will. Ezra Holloway introduced herself with Southern politeness that carried an undertone of steel. She spoke of family traditions, bloodline purity, and the importance of keeping outsiders from interfering with mountain ways that had sustained her people for generations. Her words carried weight in the hollow, evidenced by how neighbors deferred to her presence and sought her approval before speaking to the federal investigator. That evening, Sarah shared local folklore over coffee in her small apartment above the schoolhouse. Stories of cursed bloodlines and children born wrong had circulated for decades, but beneath the supernatural explanations lay hints of deliberate family arrangements that defied conventional morality. She mentioned whispered conversations about grandmother Ezra's control over marriage and breeding decisions, how young women found themselves paired with older male relatives in unions that produced children marked by increasingly severe genetic problems. The local cemetery told its own story through weathered headstones marking infant graves, generation after generation of babies who had lived days or weeks before succumbing to conditions that Marcus's medical training suggested were products of severe inbreeding. The pattern stretched back 3 decades, coinciding with Ezra Holloway's rise to matriarchal authority in the hollow. Marcus returned to his motel room that night with more questions than answers, but the shape of something monstrous was beginning to emerge from the mountain mist. The federal health department's investigation had stumbled onto something far more sinister than poor medical care, something that required courage and careful documentation to expose without becoming its next victim. Marcus spent 3 days photographing medical records before Dr. Holloway realized the scope of his investigation. The physician's cooperative demeanor evaporated when he discovered Marcus copying birth certificates that revealed patterns no legitimate medical practice would document so meticulously. Behind locked filing cabinets, Marcus found records spanning 30 years that tracked genetic relationships with the precision of a livestock breeding program. The blood typing records proved most damning. Dr. Holloway had maintained detailed charts showing genetic markers across 3 generations of the same extended family. Children listed as cousins shared identical blood characteristics that indicated much closer relationships. Rebecca Holloway's medical file contained prenatal records for 4 pregnancies, each showing genetic markers consistent with extreme inbreeding that would have required her to bear children by immediate male relatives. Sarah provided the breakthrough Marcus needed when she produced school records documenting learning assessments for every child in the hollow over the past decade. Her careful notes revealed patterns that connected intellectual disabilities with specific family lineages, creating a map of genetic damage that corresponded perfectly with Dr. Holloway's hidden medical files. Children who shared the same severe developmental delays also shared birth years that aligned with documented periods when certain male relatives had exclusive access to female family members. The truth emerged through cross-referencing birth certificates with property records and marriage licenses. Grandmother Ezra Holloway had engineered a systematic breeding program within her extended family, using religious authority and economic control to force compliance. Women in the family bore children by their grandfathers, uncles, and brothers in carefully orchestrated arrangements that Ezra justified through twisted interpretations of biblical genealogies and mountain isolation traditions. Marcus discovered that Rebecca Holloway had been impregnated by her grandfather, Dr. Edmund Holloway, beginning when she was 16 years old. The arrangement had been presented as her sacred duty to preserve family bloodlines and maintain genetic purity within their mountain community. Ezra had orchestrated the relationship, convincing both participants that their union served a higher purpose, while systematically isolating Rebecca from any outside influence that might question the arrangement. The most horrifying revelation came through testimony from a former community member who had escaped the Hollow 5 years earlier. Martha Holloway, Ezra's own daughter-in-law, had fled with her surviving child after witnessing 3 generations of deliberate inbreeding that produced increasingly severe genetic abnormalities. She described a matriarchal system where Ezra controlled reproduction through psychological manipulation, economic dependency, and religious indoctrination that portrayed inbreeding as divinely ordained. Martha's testimony revealed that Ezra had shared her own husband with multiple female relatives, including her granddaughter Rebecca, creating a web of genetic relationships that defied natural law. Dr. Edmund Holloway had participated willingly, using his medical authority to conceal the true parentage of children and to dispose of infants born with severe deformities that even the isolated community could not accept. The breeding program had operated under the guise of preserving mountain culture and maintaining family unity, but medical evidence revealed its true purpose as Ezra's method of maintaining absolute control over her extended family. Women who refused participation faced economic exile from the community, while those who complied received preferential treatment in housing, food distribution, and social standing within the Hollow's rigid hierarchy. Rebecca's tragic story emerged through careful questioning and medical examination. She had been conditioned from childhood to accept her role as a breeding vessel for family genetic preservation, taught that her sacrifice ensured the survival of their mountain way of life. By age 22, she had borne 4 children, 3 of whom displayed severe genetic abnormalities that required constant care and would never achieve mental independence. Thomas Holloway represented the program's most visible failure, a man whose severe intellectual disabilities and physical deformities marked him as the product of multiple generations of inbreeding within the same bloodline. His existence served as both warning and proof of the genetic catastrophe that Ezra's breeding program had created. Yet the community had been conditioned to view his condition as evidence of spiritual blessing rather than biological disaster. Dr. Holloway's complicity extended beyond passive participation to active facilitation of the breeding program. His medical records showed deliberate falsification of birth certificates, systematic concealment of genetic relationships, and disposal of infants whose deformities threatened to expose the program to outside scrutiny. He had used his professional authority to legitimize incestuous relationships and to provide medical cover for a system that violated every principle of genetic health and human dignity. The evidence Marcus compiled painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning 3 decades, orchestrated by a woman whose psychological control over her family had created a closed system of genetic catastrophe. Ezra Holloway had convinced her relatives that inbreeding preserved their mountain heritage while simultaneously destroying their genetic future, creating generations of children condemned to intellectual disability, physical deformity, and shortened lifespans. State authorities arrived in Holloway Hollow on a gray October morning, armed with warrants and accompanied by social workers prepared to document the scope of genetic damage that Marcus's investigation had revealed. The community's shocked silence gave way to confused resistance as federal agents began separating children from family members, whose relationships defied legal and biological norms. Ezra Holloway faced arrest with the same steely determination that had characterized her control over 3 decades of family breeding decisions. refusing to acknowledge that her genetic engineering program had created anything other than a pure bloodline worthy of preservation. Her defiance crumbled only when confronted with medical evidence that her cherished genetic purity had produced the most severe concentration of hereditary abnormalities that state geneticists had ever documented in a single community. The Tennessee State Attorney General arrived in Holloway Hollow with a convoy of social workers, medical professionals, and law enforcement officers who transformed the isolated community into a hub of federal intervention. Grandmother Ezra Holloway stood on her front porch watching strangers dismantle the genetic empire she had spent 30 years constructing, her weathered hands gripping the railing as decades of careful control evaporated in a single morning. Dr. Edmund Holloway surrendered his medical license without protest, his Vanderbilt diploma becoming evidence in a criminal case that would redefine how federal authorities approached isolated communities. The Tennessee Medical Board revoked his credentials permanently after reviewing documentation that proved his systematic falsification of birth records and deliberate concealment of genetic relationships that violated every principle of medical ethics. Rebecca Holloway required extensive psychological evaluation before authorities could determine her legal status as both victim and participant in the breeding program. State psychiatrists concluded that her conditioning from childhood had eliminated her capacity for informed consent, classifying her participation as coerced rather than voluntary. The determination protected her from criminal prosecution, while acknowledging the psychological damage that would require years of therapy to address. 43 children between the ages of 6 months and 16 years were removed from Holloway Hollow during the first week of federal intervention. Medical examinations revealed that 31 displayed genetic abnormalities consistent with severe inbreeding, ranging from intellectual disabilities to physical deformities that would require lifelong medical care. Social workers faced the unprecedented challenge of placing genetically damaged children, whose complex family relationships defied traditional adoption protocols. Thomas Holloway became a ward of the state, receiving specialized medical care for the first time in his 34 years of life. Neurological evaluations confirmed that his severe intellectual disabilities resulted from genetic damage caused by multiple generations of inbreeding within his immediate family line. Despite his limitations, Thomas responded positively to structured care and educational programs designed for adults with developmental disabilities. Sarah Mitchell coordinated the educational transition for children who had never attended school outside Holloway Hollow, working with special education specialists to address learning disabilities that affected the majority of removed children. Her documentation proved crucial in developing individualized education plans that acknowledged both genetic limitations and educational neglect that had compounded their developmental challenges. The legal proceedings against Ezra Holloway stretched across 18 months as prosecutors built a case that encompassed child abuse, conspiracy, and systematic violation of state marriage laws. Her defense attorneys argued that mountain traditions and religious beliefs provided justification for family arrangements that predated federal oversight, but medical evidence of genetic damage proved insurmountable in establishing criminal intent. Ezra's psychological evaluation revealed a complex personality that combined genuine religious conviction with manipulative control over family members, who had been systematically isolated from outside influence. Court psychiatrists concluded that her beliefs about genetic purity and bloodline preservation represented sincere convictions that had been twisted into justification for systematic abuse spanning multiple generations. Dr. Holloway faced separate criminal charges for medical fraud, child endangerment, and conspiracy in maintaining the breeding program through falsified documentation. His guilty plea included testimony that detailed Ezra's control over reproductive decisions and his own gradual complicity in arrangements that began as family traditions before evolving into systematic genetic manipulation. Rebecca Holloway's rehabilitation required relocation to a residential treatment facility in Nashville, where she could receive psychological care while maintaining contact with her surviving children. Therapists worked to help her understand that her role in the breeding program represented victimization rather than willing participation, addressing decades of conditioning that had convinced her of her sacred duty to preserve family bloodlines. The community of Holloway Hollow struggled to rebuild its identity after the removal of its matriarchal authority and the exposure of genetic practices that had defined family relationships for 3 decades. Remaining residents faced the challenge of establishing new social structures while processing the revelation that their isolated mountain traditions had created biological catastrophe. Federal intervention extended beyond criminal prosecution to include comprehensive medical screening for all Hollow residents, revealing that genetic damage from inbreeding affected every family in the community to varying degrees. The Centers for Disease Control established a monitoring program to track the long-term health consequences of systematic inbreeding in an isolated population. Marcus Williams's final report to the Federal Health Department documented the most severe case of systematic inbreeding in American medical history, leading to new protocols for investigating isolated communities where traditional practices might conflict with genetic health. His recommendations resulted in expanded federal oversight of rural medical practices and mandatory reporting requirements for communities with unusually high rates of genetic abnormalities. Educational programs introduced to Holloway Hollow emphasized genetic health and family planning, replacing folklore-based understanding of heredity with scientific information about the dangers of inbreeding. Community health workers provided ongoing support to residents adjusting to new social norms, while processing the psychological impact of discovering that their family traditions had created systematic genetic damage. The Hollow's transformation from isolated community to federal intervention site attracted academic researchers studying the intersection of cultural isolation and genetic health. Their ongoing studies of Holloway Hollow residents provided valuable data about the long-term consequences of systematic inbreeding, while respecting the privacy and dignity of community members rebuilding their lives. 5 years after the initial investigation, Holloway Hollow remained a changed community where federal oversight had replaced matriarchal control and scientific understanding had supplanted folklore-based traditions. The children removed from their families during the intervention showed varying degrees of adaptation to their new environments, with younger children demonstrating better outcomes than those who had experienced more years under the breeding program's influence. Rebecca Holloway eventually established an independent life in Knoxville, working with social services to maintain appropriate contact with her children, while continuing therapy to address the psychological damage from her years of systematic exploitation. Her recovery represented both personal triumph and testament to the possibility of healing, even after experiencing the most severe forms of family-based abuse.